When people think about the time Jesus lived in, a spiritual scene comes to mind. Sandals, miracles, a distant and abstract religious past. But for the people who were actually living at that time, life was not like this. What shaped their daily lives was not theology, but money, or more precisely, the lack of it. The world Jesus was born into had become one of the most unjust economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. And without understanding this world, it is not possible to understand why the words spoken at that time were so powerful, or to feel the same emotions. At the beginning of the first century, Judea was part of the Roman Empire. Rome had built one of the most advanced colonial systems in history. The goal of its conquests was not to lift the people up. The goal was to strengthen Rome at the center. Grain, silver, labor. Everything flowed from the edges towards the center. Judea was one of those edges. The problem was this: Judea was not a wealthy place. It was largely rural. Most people earned only enough to survive. A bad harvest did not mean we earned less this year. It meant we will go hungry this year, and Rome did nothing about it. Rome governed the region through local rulers and officials it appointed. Even kings like Herod ruled with Rome's approval. Later came governors like Pontius Pilate. Their job was not to improve the people's well-being. It was to prevent disorder and ensure that taxes continued to flow. The tax system was also ruthless. Today, we pay taxes based on income. Back then, it wasn't like that. Whether you earned money or not, you still had to pay. Land tax, crop tax, head tax, road and market taxes, and, on top of all this, religious taxes were added. So what if you couldn't pay? No one waited for you and you could not object. Tax collection was given to tax farmers. These people first paid Rome in advance, then tried to collect as much as possible from the population. Exploitation was not a mistake. This is how the system worked. If you had no money, you borrowed. And debt was a trap. Interest grew rapidly, and your land was taken as collateral. A single bad year could destroy a family. Imagine a farmer. He plants and harvests, but one year the weather turns bad. The harvest falls, and still the tax is demanded. He borrows money. Interest accumulates. The next year he cannot recover. Eventually, his land is taken from him. He becomes a tenant or a day laborer on his own land, or he disappears completely. This was not a coincidence. This was the natural result of the system. Over time, land gathered in the hands of certain people. Large estates formed. Elites grew richer. The majority became more insecure. And there was no social protection at all. No unemployment support or government aid. Family and neighborhood were the only refuge. But when everyone fell at the same time, even help was not enough. Debt did not only mean money, it was a matter of reputation, identity, and future. Losing your land meant losing who you were. This is the world Jesus was born into. And it must be said clearly, people were not poor because they were lazy or sinful. They were poor because this was the result of the system. This pressure created stress and tension in the region. Revolts broke out. Banditry increased. People were looking for a way out. A messianic expectation is not born in comfortable times, but in desperation. That is why, when people heard talk of debt forgiveness, they did not understand it as a metaphor. For them, it was a matter of life and death. When the poor were mentioned, it was not others, it was themselves. When Jesus began to speak, the ground was ready. People were tired, tense, and angry. And Jesus showed a path of hope, And there was also the temple. Today we think of the temple only as a religious place, but at that time the temple was a major economic center for people. It was a treasury, a bank, like a tax institution. Every adult man had to pay the temple tax. This tax could only be paid with a certain amount of silver coin. That meant you had to exchange money. Money changers took commission. Sacrificial animals were sold at temple-approved prices. Even if you were poor, there was no escape. You would offer a smaller sacrifice, but you still paid. And the temple authorities were also closely connected to Rome. High priests were appointed with Rome's approval. Justice was not important. Continuity was. Because of this, people began to realize something. The institution that spoke in the name of God was working together with a system that was impoverishing them. Jesus' words were exactly about this. He spoke of debt, justice, and the poor, and then he overturned the tables in the temple. Of course, this was not just religious anger. It was an action directed at the heart of the system, an objection to turning access to faith into money. At this point, things became dangerous, because Rome could tolerate inequality, but it could not tolerate anything that disrupted order. What followed is well known. Revolts, destruction, the temple reduced to ruins. Rome won. But it did not win everything, because what Jesus presented was not an army. It was another perspective, an alternative way of understanding power, debt, and value. And over time, even Rome was forced to accept this. Power alone is not enough. Legitimacy is necessary. This story reminds us of one thing. Systems do not collapse because they are unjust. This story could survive without a temple, without land. In fact, under pressure, it spread even more. They collapse when people stop believing the stories that justify them. And once you see how these stories are constructed, it becomes hard to see them the same way again.